Welcome to everyone who's here and on Zoom. Thank you for coming out tonight for what I know is going to be a great talk. I'm Carla Sinopoli. I'm the director of the Maxwell Museum, and I want to start with the Maxwell Museum land acknowledgement. The University of New Mexico and the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology sit on and among the traditional homelands of multiple sovereign nations. We acknowledge the deep connections of the Pueblo, Dene, and Apache peoples to the land, and the significant contributions of past, present, and future Indigenous peoples and communities to life and culture in the greater Southwest, the United States, and the world at large. In acknowledging these connections, we express our gratitude for the opportunity to live, work, and learn on this land. We honor our relationships with Indigenous peoples and commit to working towards reconciling injustices, restoring voices, and realizing community going forward. So International Archaeology Day, which we're celebrating here today, began in 2011 as National Archaeology Day in the United States, sponsored by the Society for American Archaeology and the Archaeological Institute of America, among other organizations. And it has since grown to an international celebration and recognition of the contributions of archaeological knowledge to the study of the human past. And it is always celebrated on the third Saturday in October. So we're a few days ahead of the curve. This year, and if you go just search International Archaeology Day on the web, you'll see some kind of fun things that they do. This year, it's a build your own monument competition. The competition ends tomorrow, so you still have time to make a Lego pyramid or whatever you think might compete. So for the Maxwell Museum, this is the 7th year we've been celebrating International Archaeology Day with a public lecture or another event. And we usually try to pair our talk with an exhibition or other activity going on in the museum. And if you haven't been across the way to the Maxwell to see our amazing exhibition on fermentation, which does feature some Andean objects, you should definitely get there during our opening hours. So having Frances Hayashida speak about her work on brewing and ceramics from the Andes is just a perfect fit. I think most people in this room probably know Professor Hayashida. She's a professor of anthropology and the director of the Latin American and Iberian Institute. And we thank both the Department of Anthropology and LAII for promoting this event. Frances earned her BA and MA from Stanford University and her PhD from the University of Michigan. And she just reminded me not to say that I knew her when she was a beginning graduate student at Michigan, and I was a finishing graduate student at Michigan at the time. So we go back almost 40 years now, a long time. She joined the anthropology department at UNM in 2008. And has been director of LAII since 2020. Professor Hayashida has directed or co-directed archaeological projects in Chile and Peru, focusing on agricultural systems, sacred landscapes, and craft production, mainly during the period of Inca rule, among many other topics. And she's a great speaker for Archaeology Day because she does it all. In addition to being a great field archaeologist, she's done work in colonial archives and museum collections, as well as bringing experience in archaeological chemistry and particularly neutron activation analysis. So she's an all-around archaeologist for International Archaeology Day. In all of her work, Professor Hayashida is passionate about collaboration with students and with international colleagues. And while I will not list all of her many publications, I do want to mention one that stands out both for its content and for its collaborative history and nature. And this is the 2022 book that she co-edited with Andres Troncoso and Diego Salazar from the University of Chile, called Rethinking the Inca, Community, Landscape, and Empire in the Southern Andes. And that book won the 2023 Society for American Archaeology Book Award, the highest award in our profession. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hayashida.
Great, thanks so much, Carla. And thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Zoom audience. So let's get started. So again, thank you, Carla, and thank you to the Maxwell Museum. It's a terrific honor to be here speaking for International Archaeology Day and to be part of the series of events on fermented foods which complement their current exhibition. Okay, so most of my talk this evening will focus on an ethno-archaeological study of maize beer production on the north coast of Peru. So one definition of ethnoarchaeology is that it's a study of contemporary context to help archaeologists understand and interpret the archaeological record. Before I present this study, I'll first briefly discuss the significance and uses of maize beer in the Andes, highlighting maize beer in the Inca Empire. I'll often be using the term chicha to refer to the beer. It's a term of Caribbean or Central American origin used by the Spanish for a variety of indigenous fermented drinks. And it's the term most commonly used today in the predominantly Spanish-speaking parts of the Andes. While maize is most commonly used to make chicha, there are also chichas of other grains, tubers, and fruits. So why study maize beer in the Andes? For more than 1,000 years, maize beer has been, and in some places continues to be, an important everyday beverage. But more importantly, maize chicha was essential for social, political, and ritual life. For example, in communities, chicha was widely used in reciprocal exchanges of food, drink, and labor. If, for example, you're building a house, others in the community would assist, receiving food and chicha for their work. And then when that neighbor builds their house, you would then assist and receive food and drink. Chicha was also used to create and maintain inequality, where political leaders would provide massive quantities of food and drink and conspicuous displays of hospitality meant to ensure subject labor contributions and loyalty. Finally, chicha was essential to maintain the favor of the ancestors and of powerful more than human beings, or wakas, who were often embodied in landscape features such as mountains, hills, and springs. Wakas were responsible for the health and well-being of people, flocks, and fields, and to ensure their favor, people fed wakas their favorite foods, which included things such as spondylus, that is spiny oyster, the shells of the spiny oyster, minerals, textiles, llamas, blood, and chicha. In the Spanish colonial period, when the Catholic Church was trying to destroy Andean belief systems, one cleric wrote, quote, "The principal offering, the best and most important part of Indian sacrifices is chicha. By it and with it, the festivals of the wakas begin, because of it they happen, and with it they end. It is everything," unquote. One of the characteristics of food served to wakas is that they, like the wakas, are alive. They are believed to possess an animating essence, and this is true of substances that we would consider inanimate, like shell, cloth, and beer. Some examples from the 15th to 16th century Andean Inca Empire help to illustrate the importance of chicha. The Inca Empire extended over Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, northwest Argentina, and northern and central Chile. The Inca brewed and served chicha in vast quantities. It was served to people working on state projects, for example, people who were building roads, building some of those amazing Inca constructions, serving in the military, as well as at periodic massive feasts at state administrative centers. It was also offered to the Inca dead and to both Inca and local wakas. The beer was brewed by women selected by the Inca, known as the Aquia. The Aquia were taken from their home communities as young women and permanently relocated to state administrative centers along the Inca Road network. At these centers, they made textiles and brewed beer for the state. And what you see on the left is an early 17th century depiction of the Aquias by Felipe Huamampoma, an indigenous writer who wrote a 1,000-page illustrated letter to the King of Spain, informing him about the abuses of indigenous people by the Spanish and about the Inca and life in the Andes. And what you see on the right is the very distinctively shaped Inca flared rim jar, or urpu in Quechua, the language of the Incas. This is a form that's found across the empire, which was used to serve beer. The subjects of the Inca were fairly mobile. That is, the state was moving them around for different things. So they were traveling to other parts of the empire as part of Inca military campaigns or to work on state projects. Wherever they went then, there was this clear, unmistakable symbol of state hospitality and generosity. This Wamampoma illustration shows agricultural activities in the month of August, when the land was opened up and early ripening maize and certain potato varieties were planted. And here you can see a woman serving chicha to those working in the fields. Here on the left, you see the living Inca ruler and his wives drinking with a mummified and deceased Inca ruler and wife on the right. Dead royals continued to be consulted and played an active political role in Inca life, and they continued to be fed and served chicha. On the right is Wamampoma's depiction of Inti Raymi, the main sun ceremony, where the Inca ruler is sharing chicha with the sun, is toasting the sun. So why an ethnoarchaeological study of chicha? Well, first, there are a few well-documented archaeological examples of chicha brewing, but lots of assumptions about, about seeing chicha in the archaeological record. So large jars, maybe they were used for chicha, but maybe they were used for something else. Second, there are few ethnographic descriptions of brewing, few detailed ethnographic descriptions of brewing. The existing accounts at the time of my study in the early 2000s were incomplete or not explicitly ethnoarchaeological. Finally, there's, over the years, a lot of loss of knowledge and traditional practices, both in chicha brewing and in the making of pottery that's used for traditional chicha brewing. So to address these issues, I conducted a systematic study of the technology and organization of contemporary chicha brewing. I worked at 2 regions on the north coast of Peru, where I worked as an archaeologist for many years. These 2 regions were in Piura, which is on the far north coast, and there I studied larger scale production by making observations at chicherias. And these are commercial operations where chicha is regularly produced for sale. It's brewed by women, and they sell out of their homes. I also worked further south on the north coast of Peru in the Lambayeque region, and there I was looking at smaller scale production. So these are household producers, women who are making chicha for their family consumption, for the weekly family consumption. In today's talk, I'm going to focus, though, on the chicherias in Piura, and particularly those in the community of Chulucanas. I became interested in chicha when I was excavating Inca pottery workshops on the north coast in Lambayeque. To understand what I was seeing archaeologically, I visited modern-day potters who used the same technologies I was observing at the Inca pottery workshops. There were few people at that time who were still making pots in the region, and what kept them in business was a demand for pottery vessels, both for water storage and to brew chicha. So here's one potter who has these paddle and anvil constructed jars, and he's doing the last step where he's paddling a design onto the surface of the vessel. And here's another potter getting ready to fire jars that were used specifically for chicha brewing. At the time of my study, there were still brewers in Chulucanas who used primarily clay vessels to make chicha, and people that I talked to on the North Coast would always say that beer that's brewed in the clay vessels tastes better. Though there were, many people, some people who were still making chicha in pottery vessels, many brewers had already switched to using metal pots for boiling and using plastic containers to ferment the chicha. This is one of the chicherias in Chulucanas, La Cartola, where they were still using the clay vessels. In Chulucanas, like many other parts of the Andes, when a chicheria has beer for sale, they're going to put out a flag like you see here. So if you're looking for a place to go get chicha, you go around to your, the usual chicha spots, and you can tell if they have a chicha ready to sell that day if the flag is out. The chicha in Chulucanas was made from a mix of malted grain, that is grain that was sprouted and dried, called pachucho, seen on the left, and unsprouted maize, as you see on the right. Malting begins to convert the starch in the grain to sugar, and sugar is what the yeast feeds on to produce alcohol. And here you see the whole grains, the pachucho and the unmalted grain. And these are the kernels that are ground down to a coarse flour, and this is what was used for brewing. Most of the maize that was used is a commercial yellow hybrid, but local varieties, like the red maize you see here in the middle of the photo, the kernels that are piled up in the middle among the pictures, these local varieties were more common in the past. A lot of local land races were lost, though, with the introduction and promotion of high-yielding hybrids. To malt the grain, the first step is to soak it. In Chulucanas, where there are many chicherias, there are businesses that specialize in producing malted grain. And this is a soaking tank at one of these operations. So the grain is piled up in there, and they fill it with water, and it's soaked for 8 to 30 hours. It's then spread out in a dark room and kept moist by sprinkling water over it for 4 to 5 days until the root emerges. The sprouted maize is then piled up and covered with plastic that's weighted down with pieces of wood. It's left like this for 7 to 12 days, during which time there's an enzymatic reaction, and the grain begins to heat up. And the pile is called an horno, or oven, because of the heat that it generates. The color of the grain changes from yellow to brown. The grain's then removed and spread out in the sun to dry for a day or two. In this process, the process of malting, the maize kernels lose about 10% of their weight. Pachucho is made in the dry months, and it's stored whole to retain its aroma and to make it less susceptible to insects. It's sold in stores or directly to chicheras, the women who brew the beer. Chicha making is a 4-day process, and the beer is ready to be sold on the 5th and 6th days. On the first day, they mix the flours of malted and unmalted grain with water and cook it for 1 to 10 hours. And the cooking time varies by brewer and by the kind of pot they're using. So if you're cooking in a metal pot, it's faster than if you're cooking in a clay vessel. The brew needs to be stirred frequently with a stick or large split cane so that it doesn't, so that the grains don't adhere to the pot and burn. And anyone who's burned oatmeal or polenta, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? You have to keep stirring it. As it's being cooked, the chicha is aerated to cool it down. And to do this, the chicheras use an umas, which is a gourd or a cut gallon jug affixed to a handle. They add water as needed. Foam rises to the surface and at times boils over. For fuel, the chicherias use algarrobo, which is Prosopis pallida. It's the same genus as mesquite. So this is a hardwood that burns at a high heat. There are other woods that are available, but people say that other kinds of woods alter the flavor of the chicha, and they prefer to use the algarrobo. And this algarrobo is now in Chulucanas is purchased. The group of pots that is used to cook the chicha is called a taberna, and the space between the vessels is covered with sheet metal, or less frequently with large pieces of broken pottery, and this is to help retain the heat. To help make the cooking vessels more resistant to thermal shock, they're smeared with clay on the exterior and sometimes cement. They may also be propped up with adobes because the bases of these vessels are round, and so they're laid into the ground a little bit and or propped up. Over time, the cooking area may become elevated, like you see in this photo, you get this accumulating mound of ash, clay that's spalling off of the vessels and eroding adobe blocks. Chicheras may also sometimes reinforce the pots with wire. Despite all these efforts, there's a super high frequency of pots breaking due to thermal shock. The Chulucanas brewers reported that their chicha cooking pots lasted only 2 to 4 weeks, but they all said that the pots used to last longer. Here's a pile of broken chicha vessels outside of a chicheria. I'll note that there were very few local potters at the time of my study, and the very high breakage rate may be due to a loss of knowledge about how to make more resistant pottery. The high rate of breakage is likely driving some brewers to shift to metal pots for cooking, because it's expensive, right? If you have to replace your cooking pots every 2 to 4 weeks, and if you're losing some of your chicha to pots breaking during the cooking process. What happens then, though, is you get this feedback, right, where you have decreased demand for pots, and then you're going to have fewer people making the pots as well. After the chicha has cooked, it's transferred to tinajones with an umas. The tinajones are these enormous open-mouth vessels that are used to cool and work the chicha. The tinajones are half buried in the ground, and when they're removed, you'll see these shallow, very round pits. This is the process of working, of trabajando, the chicha. Using a small sieve, they scoop out a little bit of afrecho, that cooked grain. They then rub it vigorously over a branch from a zapote tree. Zapote is a Capparis angulata, that has finely textured but rough bark. And rubbing it over this bark, then, they're separating out the starchy part of the maize kernels from the skin or shell, the pericarp of the kernels. During this process, they also periodically will take handfuls of the afrecho and chew it, returning the chewed grain to the tinajon. The enzymes in saliva also convert the starch in the grains to sugar, which in turn is converted by yeast to alcohol. Remember that they're using a mix of both malted and unmalted grain. So while malting converts starch to sugar, the enzymes in saliva help to convert the starch of the unmalted grain. And I'll note that the beer is boiled a second time after this step. While there are places where purely malted maize, known as jora, that's J-O-R-A, is used, brewers and chulucanas say that chicha made only with jora is hard on the stomach, and hence they add the unmalted grain. After the chicha is worked, it's passed through a large sieve to remove the coarser fragments of grain. Today they use a window screen that's laid across and put into this frame, and that's laid across an empty tinajon. And I'll note that there are many different chicha recipes, and there are accounts of chicha that, in fact, these are colonial accounts of chicha that was not sieved, and instead it was thick like a mazamorra, a porridge. The recovered bits of grain are used for animal feed in chulucanas, but there may again have been other practices. At the late prehispanic North Coastal Chimu site, Manchan, archaeologist Jerry Moore documented a pit where the afrecho had been discarded. On the morning of the second day, the chichas boiled again, this time for 1/2 to 3 hours. Some chicheras would add sugar at this point, which would sweeten the beer, but also, as it continues to ferment, boost the alcohol content. After boiling, the fire is extinguished, and the charcoal is recovered and recycled. It's sold to metal workers. It was likely also used, recovered and used for smelting and metalworking in the past. The North Coast was a center of pre-Hispanic metallurgy. They then transfer the chicha within a umas to the cooling vessels. But it's first passed through a cloth to sieve out the fine sediments. So they sieved out the coarse sediments after the first boiling, and now they're sieving out the fine sediments. And this process, this fine sieving, is called to taquear. So what happens, you have 2 women grabbing the 4 corners of this cloth, and they're rapidly moving it up and down to get the liquid to pass through. They periodically press down on the fine sediment, again, to squeeze out the liquid, and then twist the cloth to get that last bit of liquid out. What remains are the lees, called the taca, which in Chulucanas was fed to animals. And in other places I've read where, the sediment can be mixed with like a sweetener and then consumed as a treat. So this is a watercolor from the second half of the 18th century depicting a north coastal chicheria. And you can see that in terms of material culture and technology, there's a fair amount of continuity. You see a similar suite of vessels, you see the umas, the same setup for cooking, the taberna, even some kind of sheet of something laid across the top of the taberna, and two women taqueando over the steaming pot of chicha. The liquid in the tinajones is then cooled and aerated using an umas. That's also a point in time when it's sitting in the umas and cooling, when yeast that's in the air is going to be settling onto the vessel and onto the chicha. So once it's cooled, it's transferred to cántaros, and these are large, narrow-necked jars for fermentation. A loose lid is put on top. The cántaros have round bases and are stabilized with small stones or sherds. At the Chicheria La Cartola, the fermenting jars were lined up in a shallow trench and again stabilized with sherds and stones. I'll note that in this room, you can hear the chicha fermenting. All the bubbling makes a noise that sounds like water running through pipes. Chicha's lively. It bubbles and makes noise, and it also, as you know, enlivens the people who drink it. So there's no doubt contributed to it being an appropriate and favored food for wakas. So here's a close-up of the fermentation jars and supports. The chicha's left to ferment for 1 to 2 days. And again, yeast is not added separately. It's in the vessels. They only rinse them out with water. They're not cleaning them out with soap and water. And again, it's in the air, so it's settling on it, particularly when it's in that cooling in those big tinajones. When you walk into a chicheria, you can smell the yeast. It's just there in the air. On the 5th and 6th days, the beer is served. Today, it's served out of pitchers, a European form, and they use these small cut gourd bowls as drinking vessels. In the 18th century depiction of a chicheria, you see that the beer is being served out of a great big gourd that's in the middle of the table. And people sometimes, not in the chicherias, but I've seen it just out, in individual farming households where some people sometimes have these big bowls and they'll use them for fiestas for serving chicha and for serving other things. This is the Chicheria La Cartola on one of the serving days. Food is also served at chicherias, and I'll say that the atmosphere at a chicheria is pretty, friendly and mellow. There are people eating, people drinking. You see only male customers in this photo, but I've been to chicherias where there are men, women, and children. It's a very different atmosphere from a bar serving commercial beer, which tend to be, and they even have, bars, people, again, like chicherias, serving out of their homes, but serving just bottled commercial beer. And those places are usually a lot louder and a lot rowdier. So looking at a larger scale dedicated brewing location with the eyes of an archaeologist, what might we see? So we're probably going to see different vessel forms that were used to cook, right, cool, and ferment. So 3 different vessel forms to cook, cool, and ferment. You might see in these vessels signs of use. So in cooking vessels, there'll be sooting on the exterior, clay smeared on the exterior, and some discoloration from the fire. I'll note that in archaeological sites, we would excavate these, sherds from big jars that had this clay smeared on the exterior. When I've given this talk to audiences with Andean archaeologists, that they've also, people have come up to me and say, "Oh yeah, we've seen that too," and where we work. You might also get in fermentation vessels pitting on the interior. This is something that the archaeologist John Arthur has documented for traditional beer brewing vessels in Ethiopia. And at the time when I did this study, I didn't look into the interior of the vessels to see if there was evidence for this brewing. But if I go back, I'll check. There's also going to be a high frequency of broken cooking vessels. I mean, it's especially high now because they break so frequently. But you know, the thermal shock that you have with the cooking vessels is going to cause higher breakage. The other thing that you'll see if it's, again, a large-scale permanent chicha brewing installation, like you probably had at Inca administrative sites, are areas that are dedicated to different production steps. So you see in the chicherias, in the larger chicherias, you see the cooking area, you'll see the cooling area with those big tinajones that are just buried in the earth. I mean, they're fixed where they are. And then you also see a dedicated area for fermentation. The smaller chicherias, they would move those fermentation jars around. In terms of features, you'll see big hearths. This would be areas of fired earth and ash, and large grouped depressions in the floor where you had those tinajones. For tools, we might expect to find dippers, tools to stir, cloth or other materials to sieve. And when I say other materials, they could have been making sieves out of pottery with holes pierced in it. Joan Jarrow, an Andean archaeologist, documented these kinds of sieves at a site she excavated at. In ethnographic descriptions, people talk about sieving the chicha, though, in baskets that are lined with grass. Another thing you might find are the things that were used as pottery supports, as supports for the big pots, but that would be kind of harder to tell because they're mostly, just sherds and rocks. Finally, you also would find different kinds of botanical remains. So you might find the discarded afrecho, like Jerry Moore did at Manchan, or you might see residues in the pots or on the outside of the pots as well, and in floors. So what I mean by residues on the pots and in the floors. Chicha brewing can be really messy, right? So when it's cooking, the chicha may boil over or be splashed about when cooling the beer. When the chicha is being worked, when it's being rubbed back and forth across those zapote logs, a lot of the grain falls to the ground. Chicha is also spilled during transfers from cooking vessels to cooling vessels and from cooling vessels to fermentation vessels. And you can see on the floor here, right, around the vessels, all this spilled chicha on the ground. There may be residues both inside and outside of the vessels. So this is the gunk that's accumulated on the outside of a tinajon. This might vary because in some of the chicherias they would regularly scrape off or clean off, wipe down the outside of the vessels. Here you can see sherds that broke during the cooking process. One on the right, you see the maize flour that's adhered to the interior. The one on the left also has maize flour adhered to the interior, but it's been burned onto the surface. We took soil samples from the floor of one of the chicherias, and not surprisingly, we found microbotanical remains of maize. So there are things like maize phytoliths. These are microscopic silica bodies, as well as maize starch granules. I'd like to talk a little bit now about the organization of brewing and its labor requirements. A lot of archaeologists are interested in how much labor is needed for a feast, to throw a large feast. So I recorded kept track of the time and number of people needed for different steps in the production process. This information is reported in detail in one of my publications. I'm just going to hit the highlights. So the first thing to know is that even for very large-scale production, some steps, you only need one person. So the Chicheria La Cartola served 600 liters of beer a week. And the chichera did all the cooking and the transfers by herself. Other steps, you need more people, like when you're taqueando the chicha, when you're doing the fine sieving. That said, in household production, women will do this by themselves. They tie one end of the cloth to a pole, to a post, or to a chair, that's weighted down. They have the big pot with the chicha next to them, and they hold the cloth, pour it into it, and then begin to taquear. But this would be really exhausting and difficult to do for a big batch of chicha. Other labor bottlenecks in large-scale production are working the chicha, and this is a step then when the larger producers would have people come in and to help out. So this is both, the rubbing of the chicha back and forth on the logs, and also the chewing of the grain. Milling the maize, grinding the maize is another labor bottleneck. So today women purchase the maize already ground, but some houses still have the milling equipment. And so we did, some experiments seeing how long it would take to grind a certain quantity of maize. And what you see here is it's a hollowed out log mortar, and the maize is being ground with a rocker stone. And we found out that grinding is in fact a pretty labor intensive step. So just to see how this works, you can see how that stone is rocked back and forth. So how was chicha brewing learned in Chulucanas? Children, that is little girls, would accompany their family members, their female family members, and watch the process. They'd be hanging out, they'd be watching the process, they would be playing at the different steps of making the chicha, and then when they're older, then they're actually helping out in the brewing, with the brewing. While documentary sources indicate that there were male specialist brewers in pre-Hispanic times on the North Coast, today men only help with certain steps like tending the fire or transferring the beer. And this likely goes back to colonial times and the establishment of these chicherias as these household industries. What you can see in the foreground is the chichera she's cleaning out the interior of one of these big gourd bowls with a knife. And you can see the smaller gourd bowls that are around that were used for the drinking vessels. Just a couple of final observations. As I noted, there are differences in the scale and organization of brewing on the North Coast today. And here's small-scale brewing for household consumption. So this is one of the households that where I went to visit in Lambayeque. And this hearth, and so this is a person who's brewing for her family for the weekly consumption of chicha by her family. And the hearth is in back of the brewer's home. And just as I recorded the brewing process in Chulucanas, I did the same in Lambayeque, and sort of looking at all the different steps and how much time was spent, who was participating in the process. And what you can see is the chicha boiling here, and this is a pot of water that can then be added to the chicha as it begins to boil down. Here's an example of large-scale production that's temporary, not permanent. And in this case, what you're seeing is what remains after a big religious fiesta, when many families came together to make chicha, bringing vessels from home, then taking them back with them after the fiesta. The only thing remaining are small hearths on the edge of this roofed patio. And here you can see one right here on the edge of the patio, and there were other ones that were lined up here. And some of them had already been dismantled. The other thing you see are those round pits, right? And this is where the tinajones that people had brought from home were laid, put into the ground for the cooling step of chicha production. I'll note, though, that this is, if this particular area in other times was getting a lot of traffic. right? So you have people going back and forth, animals going back and forth, other activities taking place in this patio and other times of the year. And so this is going to, with time, disappear. So if you have these contexts where people are coming together periodically to collaboratively make big batches of chicha, it's not going to be as visible archaeologically compared to installations, for example, like you might get at a Inca, administrative center, where they're regularly producing large batches of beer. It's a state operation. They have this, recruited labor force, and they probably had dedicated areas for the maize beer brewing. So I focused in this lecture on the ethnoarchaeology of brewing on Peru's north coast and how observations of modern brewing can help us identify and interpret brewing in the past. A few caveats. The study has only captured a small part of the great variation in maize beer making in the Andes. And while certain practices persist, there have been huge disruptions in the 500 years since the Spanish invasion, and this needs to be considered when applying the ethnographic record to the archaeological record. So consider that in the Spanish colonial period, there were efforts to ban chicha brewing and drinking, efforts that were ultimately unsuccessful, but there was a lot of pressure and disruption on chicha brewing itself, along with all the other changes that were taking place because of Spanish, during Spanish colonial rule and subsequently. I have a whole separate paper on this topic, on the topic of why we need to be careful about applying ethnographic analogs of chicha brewing to archaeological brewing, if anyone's interested. So that's it. I'd be happy to answer questions. I want to thank everybody for attending my talk this evening, and salud. Cheers. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
So chicha was
Hold on.
constrained to the Inca. Is there similar kinds of corn-type beers in the North American corn cultures, or?
That's a good question, and I'm not the right person to ask because I am the South American specialist. But we have North American specialists here in the audience. Any? Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I'm just going to say that I can't answer that question, and I'm not even going to guess.
Okay.
And it wasn't actually and it was the Inca, but it was also societies prior to the Inca. So probably going back to certainly with the moche. Here's Margaret's here. Yes, here's the moche specialist here. And that would be what, about 500?
At least zero, time of Christ, and probably before that.
Yeah.
And we also have good evidence for chicha making in the Caribbean,
Yeah.
in Mexico, pretty much any place there's corn. I wouldn't be surprised at all if it's here in the Southwest as well.
And they're making beer, again, out of other things. So that's actually, since I did that study, there's an excavation of a Wari chicha brewery. I think Mosley is the first author on that one, right, Mosley? Where they're making chicha out of maize, but also out of Chinese moye, which is those pink pepper, what we call pink peppercorns.
How robust is that tradition? There's so much work, and it's so just so different than what we would think of as production. Is there a market for it? Is the state messing it up by health regulations, stuff like that?
No, I think the state has messed it up more by there's a long history of the state messing up different things, but so I would say though that the tradition is robust, though, because in spite of all these disruptions and in spite of it being labor intensive and such, I mean, it has such a high cultural value, right? That it's persisted over all these centuries, and even there's many places traces in food. Chicha's also brewed commercially, like in these smaller scale operations, and they continue to be pretty successful. I have to say I haven't been up. I'm curious now because I actually haven't been up to Chulupan since I did this study. Sorry, Zoom audience. I forgot you. Hopefully you can hear me now. But I'm hoping that the local demand and the the cultural significance of chicha and of the traditional foods that chicha is consumed with, right? That I think that's probably persistent.
Is it entirely a come and get it thing in terms that the consumers always come to the chicheria? Because it doesn't look like you can move that product very far geographically or.
No, but now you've given me a segue into talking about how lords, the prehispanic lords, when they would go to visit their subjects, they would travel with the chicheros. They talk about these male chicha brewing specialists, so that when they went on their circuits to visit their subjects, they would be able to feast and have the chicha producers with them, so they went around. I mean, people did things that were very labor intensive, right? It's pretty impressive when the Lord shows up with the chicha brewers and the pots and the chicha, and they have a big feast for you. Margaret?
Please go with
Oh.
You go first.
So you mentioned the women that were recruited to those centers to do the brewing. I suspect they were not volunteers, or they were?
They were not, no, so this is one of the things when the Inca would go into an area, the first thing they would do would be to take a census to see, how many people were there who could live there for the state, and also to see, to make an accounting of the people who had specialized skills. But this was also the time when they were recruiting these young women who were then removed from their home communities and permanently relocated to state administrative centers throughout the empire.
So they wouldn't go back home?
They wouldn't go back home. Margaret?
I'm interested to know what you may have come across having to do with Chicha del Año.
Okay.
And also, what can be extrapolated, what is known from the colonial period about that product?
So I know it existed. So Margaret's asking about aged chicha. So chicha will very quickly turn to vinegar. But today, and I didn't see this, people talked about it, and I didn't get to try it, though I wish I had. I should mention too, I didn't talk about what chicha tastes like. It tastes a bit like cider. It's sweet, it's light, I probably had chicha where they've added sugar, and really refreshing, it's delicious. It's also used for cooking different kinds of dishes. But it'll convert to vinegar pretty quickly, and the vinegar is also used for cooking. But they talk about aged chicha, which is put into, they said, small jars and it's buried. Okay, so if it doesn't have the if I understand correctly, and I'm not a food chemist, without the air, then it isn't going to convert. We won't have the reaction where it converts to vinegar. Right. Yeah, and people who have tasted it said that it tastes like sherry.
I've had it. It
Is
does.
it good?
It's very aromatic. It sort of aerates your sinuses
Yeah.
with a nice snifter of sherry.
Yeah,
And it's called Chicha del Año because they age it for
they
like
age
a
it, and it's
year.
for special occasions, and they make it in smaller containers, and it's talked about too. And I have the references in one of my articles, Margaret. I'll look.
Yeah.
It's talked about in colonial sources, that this was something that was produced in pre-Columbian times as well, and there are terms in the colonial dictionaries for the aged chicha. So it could be aged.
That kind of bring up an interesting question. What's the alcohol content typically?
That
Because-
I don't know, and I think there are people who've but that it's fermented for 1 to 2 days.
Yeah, that's
it's
one,
pretty light. Yeah.
right, because the process seems to be by now you understand it. And it was grain versus malt versus corn.
Yeah.
It seems to be pretty rudimentary, and the fermentation process seems to be very, very fast. and they look like they offer a lot of kind of area in the introduce oxygen to increase
Introducing oxygen.
oxygen to increase the fermentation rates. So I think the barley is pretty. There's a lot of flavor. There's a lot of variations. And,
Yeah. No, I mean, I've had it, and I do not have a high tolerance for alcohol, and it's pretty mild. But I've also been to fiestas where they'll spike it, but that's not the chicha itself. Margaret's nodding. Yeah. So, she's been to those same fiestas. So.
she got high ends.
Yeah, they'll spike it with this horrible stuff called cognac.
So there's a few questions on Zoom. Nathan Smith is asking that we don't really have a kind of spiritual or solemn alcohol consumption environment in American culture. But you mentioned the atmosphere at the Chicha Brewery was quiet and maybe respectful. Is there any relationship between that and the sacred sites like Wacas?
What a complicated and interesting question. And I'm going to refer you to Nathan, I hope you can hear me, to a really fantastic ethnography called The Hold Life Has by Catherine Allen, and she addresses both coca chewing and alcohol consumption, and consumption of different kinds of alcohol, and how certain kinds of alcohol are consumed in very specific social contexts that reinforce community, or that not necessarily reinforce community, but are very much tied into how people relate to each other and relate to these earth beings, right? And the coca is consumed in the same way, where it has this animating essence that's offered to the earth beings. And she contrasts that, though, with drinking of the commercial alcohol, that people might do on their own, and how that's completely out of, the community context, but it also takes place in these circumstances where people have to go to the city and they're, abused and they're reminded of their, marginalized status, and it's probably the best and most kind of in-depth answer, I think, to what he's asking about. But yeah, the drinking, the context of drinking are very different.
You said to that I was going to ask if there was competition between the bottled beer and chicha, or if they operate in different sort of areas of society.
I wasn't studying that specifically, and so it's just anecdotal. But the sense you get is you go to a chicheria, and like it is, you go for the food and the beer, and it's a very different kind of climate than going into a bar. And part of it too is like one of the places that was a chicheria, when I went back I think it was the next year that I went back, and it had converted to a bar, and I went back to go visit the chicheras, and it had a very different vibe. So I would feel comfortable going into a chicheria as a woman that was working by herself in the field, but I wouldn't feel comfortable going walking into a bar.
So I assume all the chicherias, and most of them, would be family businesses in a way, and they're led or owned, so to speak, by females. Is that the expectation, and is that also enforced, or is that more?
I don't know if it's enforced, but it's what I saw.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that's true most other parts of the Andes where I've seen, ethnographic descriptions of chicherias, and they're businesses that are run by women.
Would people want chicha, traditional chicha, at a wedding or feast? And if so, would they come to the chicheria, or would it ever be brought to a home or, an off-site sort of gathering?
So again, this is going to be more anecdotal because I didn't look at this systematically. But I think if you're doing it, for a family thing, you might be, just brewing it in your home, right? Because people are still this part of the Andes still, brewing.
definitely did.
They're brewing in the homes as well. Though I think if you were in town and you weren't brewing as much, maybe you would get chicha from the chicheria for a celebration. But if you have all these people that are making chicha at home, when you have a big celebration, what do? You all get together and you brew in one place and you brew together, right? So they talked about how they put these gigantic pots, on these carts, and they brought them all. This was that last slide that I showed. They brought them all to the person's house who was that year's sponsor for this particular religious fiesta. And so what was important was that they be together as a group and that they, work together to create this big feast.
Going back to that last slide, I know that they find fence posts because of the difference or whatever, so I don't know if that has been looked at or found. Also, I have no idea where it is. It's in the Andes someplace. I was really interested in it, so I didn't really take it down in my brain. But there was like stone, and you could see where they actually, chiseled the stone out. But as I'm thinking of the picture I saw of the things, because you're like, I don't know why they did that. It was up on the hill. But looking at what this is, I'm kind of like, well, did they chisel that down for these pots?
Maybe if they're for pots, the pits will be really round.
Yeah, they
So,
were.
Yeah, I mean, and I excavated, house floors where we had these big round depressions, but I don't know that they were necessarily, so, for me to say, oh, this is where they were making chicha, you'd need more than that. I kind of want to see the different steps, and because there are other reasons to have great big pots set into the ground, including they're really great for just general storage, and guarding things from pests, and so those round holes tell us that they probably had vessels sitting there, big vessels sitting here.
It just seemed funny to go that and went, oh, wow, that looks like that picture. Could it be? I don't know. And I don't know if it had anything else. It just has these holes. So, but they are very round in all places like that.
Okay, yeah, maybe.
Weird. Also, I was wondering the dippers. They look like they were mostly gourds.
Yeah.
Were they made out of anything else?
In the past, I don't know. I mean, again, I'm thinking, the context that I know, which are North Coastal, right? Mm-hmm. This is an area where they're growing a lot of gourds and using gourds for containers for all kinds of things. Okay. And so, yeah, they had these big, beautiful gourds that they would, or, they'd have the gallon jugs and they would slice off part of it. Plastic is, like everywhere else, right? Including us. Plastics replace so many things.
Right.
Oh.
I'm sorry, was there another question? Oh, yeah. So I know that you were talking a little bit about colonial brew, and so for some of the, especially rural brew, was there more of a continuous tradition in Tennessee, even when, it was from colonial people trying to limit that? Or was there like a period of brews?
So I can only say kind of bits of information I know, and again, I haven't looked at this systematically. But you do see this break because they switch over to this commercial, brewing and chicherias in a lot of parts of the Andes, including the North Coast, and that's why you see, this was a number of years after the Spanish came in, but those watercolors that show chicherias, whereas we know that in probably prehispanic times, they had these specialized communities of brewers, and they talk about having male brewers, which disappears during the colonial period. The other thing we know, though, is that when there were these efforts to eradicate chicha brewing and drinking on the North Coast, both because they said, or in different parts of the Andes, both because of drunkenness, but also because chicha was so important for ritual practices, and they're trying to extirpate Andean belief systems, right? But one of the things that happened is that, people receiving chicha is part of what's expected if you're doing any kind of work project, whether you're working with your neighbors or whether you're working for some lord or political leader. And what happened was that when they cut off the chicha, people wouldn't work. And they said, no chicha, no work. And so they started letting people serve chicha again. And the chicha too that, I don't know if you put it here, but the chicha that people would be bringing out to the fields now, it's this daily beverage, it's this lightly fermented chicha, right? Or even not, it doesn't even, you don't taste any alcohol at all when it's fresh. So it's not, anyway, so, yeah. Those are just some anecdotes, but I don't think I fully answered your question. Okay.
I'll join you in thanking you.
Thank you, everybody.